Hello everyone and welcome to the very first episode of Emmi Explains Art. My name is Emmi and today we are explaining the Raft of the Medusa. And welcome to this very first episode of Emmi Explains Art. In this series, I will be deep diving into different works of art and just kind of having a casual chat about them and telling you guys everything I know and everything I've learned. So yeah, today we are talking about one of my favorite paintings of all time, the Raft of the Medusa. This was painted in 1819 by Théodore Géricault. It took a couple years to complete, but it was completed in 1819 and shown in the Salon in Paris in that year as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and get right into the painting. The first thing we do in art history to understand a painting is visual analysis. Visual analysis is just taking a work of art and kind of dissecting it in all of its different elements so that we can further understand it, because you can't really understand what a piece means or what it's trying to say without knowing exactly what you're looking at. So, what are we looking at here? We see a lot of people piled onto a wooden raft that is floating in a really violent and maybe stormy sea. We can tell because there's waves in the background that are very large and the sky looks a little stormy. And what we can also see with the people on the raft is that they are kind of on one side of the painting clambering up and lifting up a man who is waving off to a ship that is very tiny off on the horizon, and we will talk more about that little tiny ship later. But yeah, so this is a very chaotic, energetic moment in time that has been captured in the painting, and it is Gericault's interpretation of a moment that happened on the raft. Also, something I want you to know, because it's going to come back up later, is just how large this painting is. I'm going to insert a picture here of people standing in front of it so you can understand the scale. This is really important because it makes the viewer feel like they are in the space with them. They are on the raft and they are feeling the same type of way that the people on the raft might have felt. So now that we know what we're looking at, let's go through the background. What is actually this raft? Where did it come from? Who are these people? Stuff like that. So the year is 1816 and France has sent a fleet of ships to Senegal to attempt to reclaim it from British rule and put it back under French rule. I'm not going to go into Senegal's very long history with colonization here, but if you want to learn more about Senegal's history, I will put some resources down below in the description box for you to check out and learn more. So one of the ships in this fleet was called the Medusa, which is what we see in the title, and there were about 400 people on this ship. And unfortunately, due to an error by the captain, it ran aground, and there were not enough lifeboats for everyone. So really unfortunate. We're off to a really horrific start. Can you guess who might have gotten the lifeboats first? If you said the wealthy people, you were correct. You were correct. So the wealthy, the higher class, high status people, they got to get on the lifeboats, and the lower class, maybe poor people, they were kind of screwed just a little bit. And so the ship's captain ordered the carpenter of the ship to construct a raft made out of whatever he could find. So he builds this raft, and originally there were 150 people on it. And the idea was that the raft would be pulled behind one of the lifeboats. However, the people in the lifeboat realized that it was slowing them down and they were never going to make it to shore or be rescued with pulling this raft behind them. So they severed the rope. They cut the rope that connected the two and left the raft just floating in the sea. And they ended up floating for 13 days. 13 days stuck on the ocean in a sea full of waves and storms, and it was bad. It was really bad. And this led to murder and cannibalism. Yeah, really horrific scene. This was a story heard all around France and was major headlines. So in the image, we can see that they are waving off to a ship in the distance, like I mentioned, and the ship in the distance is supposed to be the ship called the Argus. The Argus would not come pick them up in this moment. It would actually pass them the first time and come back to rescue them hours later. So that's another interesting thing to think about in this painting, is that this is a moment of false hope. It seems like they are so excited and yes, this is our moment, we're going to get rescued, we're going to be okay, and then they're not, and it's not until later that they actually are rescued. When the Argus does come to rescue them, there were only 10 survivors. Remember, it started with 150 people on this raft and there were only 10 survivors. So this was a really, really horrific, catastrophic thing, and it was super influential, and that's why Gericault wanted to capture it in painting, and we will talk a little bit more about its larger context and meaning in a little bit. So like I said, this was a story straight out of the headlines that Gericault decided to paint. And this is not the only time that an artist has ripped something from the headlines. I will insert some other pictures here of paintings that are from, you know, current events and stuff. Something that I love about this painting is the story of how much research Gericault did before he painted it. He was a very thorough researcher before he did paintings. He did a lot of artistic studies, you know, drawings and smaller paintings, but he also interviewed the survivors from the raft and got their stories and what they felt when it was happening and what exactly happened while they were on this raft for 13 days. And these interviews allowed him to portray the emotions that they were feeling through the painting in a very dramatic and cinematic way almost. Another thing he did to prep for this painting was he recreated a full-scale model of the raft, and he needed to get a bigger studio to do that. So he got this bigger studio, had a full-scale raft in there so he would know, you know, how many people could I fit on here? What would that look like? What would their forms look like? Stuff like that. Another thing he did is he went to the coast to see how the water moved. What did the waves look like? What would they have looked like when they were on this raft? And he was really trying to understand the experience of these survivors as much as he could. You know, no one could know exactly what it felt like, but by doing this research, he could begin to, you know, get the picture and therefore portray it in his painting as accurately and as emotionally as possible. Another thing that Gericault is very well known to do, he was very interested in anatomy, which is a very common thing in art. You know, if you're painting a figure, you need to understand how the body looks and what the muscles look like, things like that. But he took it a step further. He knew that in this painting, he was going to include dead bodies that had been dead for some time. So he wanted to understand what the human body looks like as it decomposes. And so he went to the morgue and he retrieved some body parts and he let them sit in his studio and decompose. He was a strange guy, okay? Really odd, but he was a great artist, just a little bit strange. And one person even said that he would leave the body parts in his studio until the stench was actually unbearable, and then and only then would he remove them. So, like I said, strange guy, but great artist. Okay, so now that we know a little bit more about the context of the painting, let's talk about what we actually see. So let's talk about the figures, the people that we see. First thing that I want to talk about is how these are very idealized forms. You can tell that these people are jacked, okay? They are super muscular. They are honestly ripped, which is just not super realistic. The average person does not look like that. These forms are very much based on ancient Greek and classical statues and paintings and things like that, which was a very common thing to do, and he was coming out of the neoclassicism movement, so again, he's very inspired by ancient works of art and using that to inform the way his figures look. I want to draw your attention to a couple different people here. So first, I want to talk about the man at the top of the pyramid, shall we say. So like I said, there's this stack of bodies with a man at the top, and this man is supposed to represent a Senegalese man. Hi, editing Emmi here once again. I totally forgot to explain why the man being Senegalese is so important, so I will explain now. As I mentioned earlier, this is the focal point of the painting. This is where your eye is drawn to first, and by Gericault making him Senegalese, he is pointing out that the entire reason that this fleet of ships was on the sea to begin with, the entire reason the Medusa was out, was to colonize Senegal for France. So he's kind of pointing out like, oh, let's not forget why this happened in the first place. Colonization. So that's why the man being Senegalese is so important. And now I want to draw your attention to this pair of figures in the bottom left. We see a man with some gray curly hair, and the red piece of fabric over him might be a cloak. He is holding on to the body of a younger man who seems to be dead, and this is often theorized to be a father and son duo. So the son has unfortunately passed away, and the father is holding on to his body to prevent it from falling into the sea and being lost forever. And this is where we start to talk about emotion, because in this painting, every figure seems to be displaying some different type of emotion. So we have the father who, in my opinion, you know, some people will say he looks, you know, like full of despair and depression and sadness. And I don't think that those things aren't true. I just think that to me, it reads more as apathy. If you were in this situation, if you were on the raft of the Medusa, your brain would not be able to comprehend the traumas that you have seen and experienced, and your brain would go into shock, and you would not be able to form any sort of emotion or coherent thought. And so that's why I think, to me, his face and the way he looks is displaying just apathy. Like, I'm so traumatized that there is no way that I could have any emotion other than that right now. That's just my personal opinion on the painting. Some people, like I said, think differently. If you have a better way of describing that, or maybe a different opinion, please feel free to share. I would love to get a discussion going on different opinions and stuff. So anyways, back to the painting. Like I said, on the left side, you have this very despair, depression, sadness, apathy, and then on the right side of the painting, you have the people who are clamoring up with excitement and hope that they might be rescued. And you can see on their faces, they're very animated. Their eyebrows are lifted and their mouths are open. They are, you can feel the energy coming from them of this basically hope that they might be rescued. And something I just love about this moment is that they are full of action. You can see them reaching up and clambering up and just trying to get higher so that the ship might see them better. And I just love how this is a very brief, exact moment in time. It's like a frame, a very small frame of a movie or something that is captured forever. And I just love this painting, in case you couldn't tell. Okay, we've talked about figures. Now let's talk about composition. So this composition utilizes a lot of triangles, and I will point those out to you now. So we have the triangular stack of bodies, which I mentioned before, which is kind of the main focal point. That's where your eye is naturally going to go to first. But you also have the lines connected to the sail and the mast in the middle. That also forms a triangle. So there's kind of these two triangles. One is more prominent than the other, but it kind of guides your eye around the painting, which is what composition is meant to do. It's to guide your eye to where you want it to go. I also want to talk about the raft itself in terms of the composition. So the raft, the corner of it comes towards us as the viewer, right? And this is also important when we talk about the scale of the painting, because not only does it feel like you are there with them, but viewing this painting, it feels like you could step onto the raft and be there in the image. And that is accomplished by the lines of the raft coming diagonally towards us, or you can think of it as going away from us into space, which also means that this raft is foreshortened. Here is your art history vocab word of the day: foreshortening. This is when a form is compressed to make it seem like it moves away or towards the viewer. This is kind of a hard thing to accomplish in drawing and illustration and painting, because you have to think of a form in a 3D space, but you are putting it onto a 2D surface. I will insert some other images here of good examples of foreshortening so you can kind of understand what I mean. So it makes the form seem smaller, but to our eye, it looks as if it goes away from us. Okay, so let's talk about some societal impact and meaning in this painting. So let me remind you that the ship, the Medusa, ran aground because of a failure by the captain. This is important because the captain was appointed by the king. The king chose that captain, and therefore a failure on the captain's part means a failure on the king's part. And by Gericault painting this image and reminding everyone of this failure, it is an anti-monarchical statement. He is saying the king has failed. The king failed to protect us. The king failed to keep us safe. And now look what has happened. This catastrophic thing has happened because the king wasn't able to do his job. So now let's move to understanding this piece in the broader context of art history. So this is one of the first paintings of the Romanticism movement. This movement started in about 1815. Remember, this painting was finished in 1819. And this movement started in France, and it was mainly a response to Enlightenment. Enlightenment was a movement that the basic of it is that you can understand things like nature, like the human body, like everything through logic and reason and rationality. I will insert some images here that kind of encapsulate what Enlightenment is. So Romanticism is a response to that because, and especially this painting, because it points out that control over the future with laws and ration and reason is great, but there's still corruption. There's still corruption that led to this event happening. And if you, Mr. Enlightenment,
It's the age of enlightenment.
that was a quote from Hamilton accidentally. If you, Mr. Enlightenment, think everything can be understood and solved through reason and rationality, then why did this still happen? You know, there is no one certain answer that solves all of the problems. And another key point of Romanticism is emotion and the human experience. That is like, if you had to say what is Romanticism, why is it there, I would say human experience, because that is something that cannot be understood through reason and logic. Think about how many times you have thought to yourself, I'm feeling some type of way and I don't really know why. Right. Emotions are hard to understand. You know, the human experience and the way we interpret our world is hard to comprehend, and it cannot be comprehended through just logic, you know? And like I said, emotion is a huge part of this painting, and the whole point was to make the viewer feel like they felt on the raft. So some other key points of Romanticism is fluid brushwork. That is something that's very common in Romanticism. Energized compositions, which we definitely see here in this piece. You know, like I said, it's a moment captured in time and there's lots of movement. And also another point of Romanticism is diagonals in the composition, which we definitely see in the triangle composition here. And also one of my favorite things about Romanticism is the power of nature. And we can see that element in the painting through the massive waves that seem to be surrounding the raft and kind of could crush them at any moment. So very power of nature there. The last thing I want to point about this painting is back to the scale of it. So paintings this large were often reserved for heroic images. Think the Oath of the Horatii. Insert picture here. Also, I say Horatii. That's how I was told to say it. If someone else says it differently, apologies, but I say Horatii. Anyways, back to this. So this painting is a very heroic moment. You know, these three figures are giving their lives for something, and this was very common for large-scale paintings to be these very heroic images. Raft of the Medusa is not a heroic image. It is pointing out a failure of the king and a failure of society, and to put that in such a large scale was definitely a new thing, but he's kind of saying, like, I'm gonna point out in large capital letters what is wrong with our society in a way. He's saying these deaths and this unnecessary catastrophe was caused by greed and incompetence and abandonment, and I'm gonna say that in this giant painting, and I don't care that it's supposed to be reserved for heroic images, because that's not real. Heroic images aren't real. This is. This happened. So yeah, overall, this painting conveys a lot about society at the time in France in the early 1800s, and it also is super important to the Romanticism movement, like I said. So yeah, I hope you understand now why I love this painting so much. There's just so much going on and so much to talk about, and I'm just kind of giving a brief overview. I will put some resources down below of some further reading if you want to like learn more and see some theories about other paintings and stuff related to it. So yeah, make sure to check those out if you want to learn more. And I have one last quote to talk about in relation to the Raft of the Medusa. This is from a historian named Jules Michelet, and he said, "Our whole society is aboard the Raft of the Medusa." Great quote. Great quote. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned a little something and appreciate this painting almost as much as I do now. But yeah, make sure to subscribe if you want to see more of my videos. Stick around for the next episode to see what I will be explaining next. Bye guys.